Christmas tree?
It's waiting.
We're stuck in here! Go get help!
In an era where environmental catastrophe feels less like science fiction and more like impending reality, The Last House arrives as a timely meditation on survival, family bonds, and the fragility of our comfortable existence. Directed by Louis Leterrier and penned by Matthew Robinson, known for Good Luck, Have Fun, Don't Die, this compelling genre bender walks a fascinating tightrope between high-concept sci-fi thriller and grounded domestic drama. The result is a film that may frustrate viewers seeking concrete answers to its central mystery, but will resonate deeply with anyone who's contemplated raising children in an increasingly uncertain world. The hows and whys of The Last House take it into science fiction territory lightly and elusively so at first, but eventually with more concrete, affects heavy world building and unbuilding. But the film is most compelling throughout as a straightforward domestic drama, with increasingly fraught family dynamics lending proceedings a baseline of credibility even as whatever's happening outside the house remains largely inscrutable. Grounded, empathetic performances by WagnerMoura and GretaLee, as parents hanging onto their adult authority by a thread, deserve much of the credit for that, as does the intricately detailed, changeable design and conception of the house that, in a short time, becomes the character's entire world. The thematic landscape, climate anxiety and modern isolation. The Last House mostly works as a tensely enjoyable ride for times of environmental anxiety, though whether there's any substantial meaning or resonance to the what-if scenario devised by screenwriter Matthew Robinson is open to question. The film touches on ideas of climate change and ecosystemic adaptation, as well as to both the virtues and limitations of community spirit, but they're not very deeply or provocatively probed, settling for loose platitudes doled out by an unidentified female narrator. The opening narration sets an evocative, melancholic tone that permeates the entire film. "We lived closer to each other then," the mysterious narrator intones, describing the world before the Great Shut-in. But it was easy to feel alone. This paradox of modern existence, the simultaneous experience of overcrowding and isolation, provides the philosophical foundation for what follows. It's a sentiment that will ring painfully true for anyone who's lived through recent years of social distancing, lockdowns, and the strange alienation that can occur even when surrounded by family. The film's approach to climate change and environmental collapse is notably oblique. Rather than delivering heavy-handed messages about carbon emissions or ecological destruction, Robinson's screenplay opts for a more metaphorical approach, using the mysterious force that traps the Delgado family as a stand-in for larger, less definable existential threats. This choice will divide audiences. Some will appreciate the film's restraint and its focus on human responses over didactic messaging, while others may find the lack of concrete political engagement frustrating in a film that so clearly invites environmental readings. What The Last House does exceptionally well, however, is capture the particular anxiety of parenthood in an age of climate uncertainty. How do you prepare children for a future you can't predict? How do you maintain hope and normalcy when the world outside seems to be crumbling? These questions hover over every frame, even as the film wraps them in genre conventions. Meet the Delgados, a family portrait on the brink. Not that there's much room for loneliness in the close-knit Delgado family, who are introduced making early Christmas plans as winter sets in. The film's opening act establishes a portrait of comfortable, if slightly strained, middle-class domesticity that will be instantly recognizable to many viewers. They live comfortably, even if engineer dad Jason WagnerMoura is currently out of work, and happily, even if pre-teen siblings Graham Noah Alexander Sosnovsky and Ruth Riley Chung squabble on the regular. These small details matter enormously in establishing the film's emotional stakes. Jason's unemployment isn't just a plot point, it's a subtle indicator of economic precarity that exists even before the mysterious crisis begins. His professional identity as an engineer proves crucial later in the film, as his technical knowledge becomes essential to the family's survival, but initially, his joblessness creates a quiet tension, a slight crack in his authority and self-worth. WagnerMoura, perhaps best known for his riveting portrayal of Pablo Escobar in Narcos, brings a completely different energy to Jason. Warm, resourceful, occasionally overwhelmed, but fundamentally decent. His Jason is a man trying to maintain control in a situation that defies all logic, and Moura navigates this impossible position with remarkable subtlety. There's no scenery chewing here, no dramatic breakdowns, well, not at first. Instead, we watch a slow erosion of confidence, punctuated by moments of ingenuity and determination. GretaLee, coming off her acclaimed performance in Past Lives, is equally nuanced as Anne. Mom Anne frets about signs of structural damage in their roomy mid-century home, but overall, they have it better than most. Lee brings an anxious intelligence to the role, portraying Anne as the family's emotional radar, constantly scanning for threats and problems before they fully materialize. Her early concerns about the house's structural integrity prove grimly prescient, but Lee ensures that Anne never comes across as simply the worried mother archetype. She's practical, observant, and increasingly willing to make hard choices as the situation deteriorates. The child performances deserve special recognition. Noah Alexander Sosnovsky and Riley Chung, as siblings Graham and Ruth, avoid the twin pitfalls of child acting. They are neither precociously adult nor cutely childish. Their squabbling feels genuine, rooted in real sibling dynamics rather than screenplay contrivance. As the film progresses and the children are forced to mature rapidly, both young actors rise to the challenge, portraying the loss of innocence with heartbreaking authenticity. The crisis begins, trapped in comfort. The inciting incident arrives with elegant simplicity, especially when, with a heavy November rainstorm raging outside, they find they literally can't leave the house. Doors and windows are rendered unopenable by some outside force. Attempts to break the glass prove likewise futile. This scenario immediately recalls other domestic entrapment narratives, from Sartre's No Exit to recent films like Vivarium. But The Last House distinguishes itself through its methodical exploration of what this situation would actually mean in practical terms. How do you verify what's happening? How do you communicate with the outside world? What are your first priorities? Others in their street, they discover, are similarly trapped. With the internet down and phone signals cut, they can only guess at how widespread the crisis is. At least early on, a spirit of plucky resilience prevails. Neighbors communicate by signboards, food is lightly rationed, and family movie nights alternate the only 2 DVDs in the house. The detail about the 2 DVDs, Annie, and Air Force One, hilariously is the kind of specific, absurdist touch that grounds the film's more outlandish elements. It's both funny and sad, suggesting the random limitations that shape life in extremis. One can imagine the debates about which to watch tonight, the growing fatigue with both options, the way these artifacts of their previous life become simultaneously comforting and maddening. The signboard communication with neighbors provides some of the film's most creative visual storytelling. Leterrier and his team use these simple exchanges to build a sense of community and shared experience without ever leaving the Delgado household. We see solidarity, cooperation, dark humor, and eventually desperation, all conveyed through handwritten signs held up to windows. It's a low-tech solution to communication that feels both inventive and plausible. The long haul, when days become weeks become months. But as days turn to weeks, and a Spartan Christmas gives way to a very unhappy New Year, the family must consider the possibility that this is a grim new normal. The film's second act chronicles the slow psychological and practical deterioration that comes with extended confinement. This is where The Last House most clearly reflects our collective experience of pandemic lockdowns, though the film's genesis predates COVID-19. There's a particular kind of temporal disorientation that sets in when days lack normal markers and rhythms, when you can't leave, when seasons change only as observed through windows, when the future becomes completely opaque. Leterrier resists the temptation to montage through this period quickly. Instead, we feel the weight of time passing, the accumulation of small frustrations, the way coping mechanisms that work for a few days prove inadequate for months. The Christmas sequence is particularly effective, balancing the family's attempts to maintain tradition and joy against the growing awareness that their situation may be permanent. The gifts are makeshift, the meal is rationed, and the forced cheerfulness carries an undercurrent of despair.
If Robinson's script is fuzzy on the logistics of who or what is keeping them inside, the explanation, when it does arrive, doesn't exactly hold water. Though Leterrier builds up to the reveal with eerie flashes of life outside the living room window, it's stronger on the tensions playing out indoors. This is perhaps the film's most significant weakness from a pure plot perspective. Viewers seeking a rigorous, scientifically coherent explanation for the entrapment will likely be disappointed. The reveal, when it comes, raises as many questions as it answers, and some of the logic doesn't quite track. However, it's worth considering whether this ambiguity is a flaw or a feature. By keeping the external threat somewhat vague and inexplicable, the film maintains its focus on the human drama, on the family's response rather than the crisis itself. The glimpses we get of the outside world through the window are genuinely unsettling. Leterrier uses brief, disorienting flashes of imagery that suggest something fundamentally wrong with reality itself. These moments are all the more effective for their brevity and incompleteness, allowing our imagination to fill in the horrifying gaps. Parenting at the end of the world, authority under pressure. As the situation grows increasingly dire, Jason and Anne are caught between their gentler duties as parents and more harshly pragmatic survival instincts. Graham and Ruth, both characters drawn, cast and played with unusual nuance, must grow up fast without any wider society to show them the way. This central tension drives much of the film's dramatic weight. How much do you tell children about how desperate things have become? At what point do you stop trying to maintain normalcy and start preparing them for a harsh new reality? Jason and Anne find themselves making impossible calculations, trying to preserve their children's innocence while also ensuring their survival. The film handles these dilemmas with admirable complexity. There are no easy answers, and the parents don't always agree on the right approach. Anne tends toward honesty, wanting to prepare the children for worst-case scenarios. Jason initially tries to maintain a protective bubble, shouldering burdens alone until it becomes clear this isn't sustainable. Their disagreements never devolve into melodramatic arguments. Instead, they reflect genuine philosophical differences about parenting under extreme circumstances. Graham and Ruth's accelerated maturation is handled with particular sensitivity. They don't suddenly become mini adults with precocious wisdom. Instead, we see them grasping toward maturity unevenly, sometimes reverting to childish behavior, sometimes displaying surprising resilience. The script gives them agency without making them unrealistically capable. They have ideas, they contribute to survival strategies, they sometimes make mistakes, and they ask hard questions their parents can't fully answer. Notwithstanding the absurdly particular conditions of its drama, The Last House should resonate with anyone attempting to raise children in a world physically changing before our eyes. This is the film's most successful thematic achievement. While most parents won't face literal entrapment in their homes by mysterious forces, the emotional reality of raising children in an age of climate crisis, political instability, and social fragmentation will feel immediately relevant. How do you give children hope for a future that feels increasingly uncertain? How do you teach them resilience without frightening them? How do you maintain your own authority and competence when you're terrified and uncertain yourself? Moments of light, ingenuity and human resourcefulness. If it raises some glum, existential questions, at least Jason's ingenious MacGyver-style apocalypse hacks offer comparative light relief. One of the film's pleasures is watching Jason apply his engineering knowledge to increasingly desperate circumstances. These sequences provide essential tonal relief from the mounting tension, and they also serve a deeper thematic purpose. They show human creativity and problem-solving persisting even in the face of impossible odds. Jason's innovations range from the practical water collection and filtration systems to the brilliantly makeshift I won't spoil some of the more creative solutions. These scenes showcase Moura's ability to convey both intellectual engagement and physical determination. We see Jason focused, in his element, rediscovering purpose and competence through practical problem solving. It's a reminder that skills and knowledge, particularly technical and practical knowledge, become invaluable in crisis situations. These sequences also provide opportunities for family collaboration. Graham, in particular, becomes Jason's assistant, learning skills that seem archaic in the age of smartphones and professional service providers but become essential for survival. The scenes of father and son working together to solve problems offer some of the film's most quietly moving moments, showing how crisis can deepen bonds even as it strains them. Leterrier's direction, balancing intimacy and spectacle. A French genre journeyman whose credits range from The Incredible Hulk to Fast X, Leterrier keeps it all ticking with the requisite balance of itchy cabin fever atmospherics and more expansive action set pieces. Louis Leterrier might seem like an unusual choice for what is essentially a chamber piece family drama with sci-fi elements. His background in large-scale action spectacle would suggest a director more comfortable with explosions than domestic tension. However, The Last House demonstrates impressive range, showing that Leterrier can modulate his approach to serve the material. The cabin fever atmospherics are established through careful control of space and repetition. We become intimately familiar with the layout of the Delgado home, with its specific rooms and corridors, to the point where it begins to feel constraining for us as viewers as well as for the characters. Leterrier uses gradually tightening framing as the film progresses, the camera moving from wider establishing shots in the early sections to increasingly close, claustrophobic compositions as time passes and psychological pressure mounts. The action set pieces, when they arrive, provide essential punctuation to the slow burn tension. Though given its sometimes chintzy digital effects, the film is most effective when it plays on what you cannot see. This is a crucial observation. The film's budget limitations become apparent in some of the larger-scale visual effects sequences, where the digital work doesn't quite achieve photorealistic integration. However, Leterrier proves adept at using suggestion and partial revelation to maximize impact while minimizing the exposure of less convincing effects. The most effective horror in science fiction has always understood that what we imagine is often more powerful than what we see. The Last House works best when it embraces this principle, using sound design, reaction shots, and carefully controlled glimpses to suggest the strangeness and horror of what's happening outside. The moments when the film fully shows its hand, revealing the scope of the external situation, are often less impactful than the slow accumulation of dread built through more subtle means. Production design. The house's character. Kevin Jenkins' production design is the most consistent technical asset here, attentive to the detailed wear and tear of the Delgados, moldering house as it literally cracks under pressure, as well as the ways in which it's modified to protect and sustain its inhabitants. If there's a single element that elevates The Last House above standard genre fare, it's Jenkins' exceptional production design. The Delgado home begins as an attractive, lived-in mid-century structure spacious enough to feel comfortable but not ostentatiously large, showing the slight wear and needed repairs that characterize real family homes rather than movie-perfect sets. As the film progresses, we watch this space transform in meticulously detailed ways. The structural damage that Anne worried about in the opening scenes becomes increasingly pronounced. Cracks spread across walls and ceilings. Windows develop stress fractures. The house quite literally cannot sustain the pressure of whatever force is acting upon it. Jenkins and his team track this deterioration with impressive consistency, ensuring that damage accumulates logically and that the spatial integrity of the house evolves in believable ways. Simultaneously, we see the family's modifications to their environment. Spaces are repurposed for food storage, water collection, makeshift gardening. The neat, organized home gradually becomes cluttered with survival equipment, with the detritus of long habitation, with increasingly desperate measures. But there's still everyday mess and clutter in evidence, at every stage of its evolution. The Last House may be silly in some respects, but it has a stabilizing sense of how life actually goes on when everything ends. This last point is crucial. Lesser films would present either pristine environments or total chaos. The Last House understands that real life is messier and more contradictory. Even in crisis, people try to maintain some order and routine. Even when carefully rationing, there are still dirty dishes, still clothes that need washing, still the small, mundane tasks that constitute daily existence. The production design honors this reality, creating a space that feels genuinely inhabited rather than simply designed. The evolution of the house also serves as a visual metaphor for the family's psychological journey. As the structure physically degrades and is modified for survival, so too does the family's initial structure, their roles, their relationships, their sense of normalcy break down and reconstitute in new forms. Cinematography and visual storytelling. While the production design receives deserved praise, the cinematography by cinematographer name, if known, also merits discussion for its contribution to the film's effectiveness. The visual approach shifts subtly throughout the film's runtime, reflecting the changing circumstances and psychological states of the characters. Early sequences employ naturalistic lighting and relatively stable, classical compositions. The house is lit warmly, emphasizing the comfort and security of the family's initial situation. As the crisis extends, the lighting becomes harsher, more practical, reflecting the family's reliance on limited power sources and natural light. Shadows deepen, creating pockets of obscurity within the familiar space. The camera work becomes gradually more handheld and unstable as tensions mount, particularly during conflict scenes between family members or during crisis moments. However, Leterrier and his cinematographer avoid the shaky cam excess that has plagued some modern genre films. The instability feels motivated by the emotional content of scenes rather than being a default stylistic choice. The film makes effective use of windows both as frames within frames and as the primary connection to the outside world. Some of the most striking compositions place characters looking out at the incomprehensible changes occurring beyond their prison, their faces reflected in the glass, layering interior and exterior, known and unknown, in single images. Sound design and score. The auditory dimension of dread. The sound design of The Last House deserves recognition for building atmosphere and suggesting the scope of external events without always showing them. The soundscape of the house changes as the film progresses from the normal ambient sounds of a functioning home to increasingly ominous creaks, structural stress, and mysterious sounds from outside.
The external audio is particularly important given the film's limited visual access to what's happening beyond the house. We hear things we cannot fully see or understand: strange atmospheric phenomena, distant disturbances, the unsettling silence that sometimes follows. This creates a persistent sense of unease, of a world out there that has fundamentally changed in ways the characters and audience cannot fully grasp. The musical score supports rather than overwhelms the drama. There's restraint in the scoring choices, with music used selectively rather than constantly. This allows silence and ambient sound to carry emotional weight in certain sequences, while the score can make more impact when it does arrive. The thematic material tends toward the melancholic rather than bombastic, reflecting the film's interest in human loss and endurance over straightforward action thrills. Thematic depth and limitations. Returning to the question of the film's thematic substance, The Last House occupies an interesting middle ground. It's clearly more thoughtful than a simple high-concept thriller, using its premise to explore genuine anxieties about family, survival, community, and environmental collapse. However, it stops short of the deeper philosophical or political engagement that might elevate it to the level of the most resonant science fiction. The environmental themes are present but somewhat underdeveloped. The film gestures toward climate change and ecological collapse without fully committing to these ideas or exploring their implications in depth. Some viewers will appreciate this restraint, preferring the focus on human drama over didactic messaging. Others will find it frustrating that a film so clearly invoking environmental catastrophe doesn't have more to say about it. The community dynamics, the way neighbors attempt to support each other while trapped in their separate homes, offer interesting commentary on the possibilities and limitations of mutual aid in crisis situations. We see solidarity and cooperation, but also the inevitable way that extended crisis makes such cooperation difficult to sustain. Each family ultimately must prioritize its own survival, even as they recognize the value of community support. The film also touches on questions of adaptation and resilience. What does it mean to adapt to circumstances that seem to demand the impossible? How do humans maintain psychological coherence when confronted with situations that defy understanding? The Delgado's journey offers one answer. You focus on what you can control, you develop practical solutions to practical problems, you hold on to relationships and routines as anchors, and you keep going even when the larger situation remains incomprehensible. Returning to the performances that ground all of this conceptual material in human emotion, it's worth examining in greater depth what makes the acting in The Last House so effective. WagnerMoura brings layers of subtle characterization to Jason. His performance is built on small moments: the slight hesitation before answering his children's difficult questions, the way he squares his shoulders before attempting another engineering solution, the brief moments when his mask of competence slips and we see the fear underneath. Moura never goes broad with the emotion, everything is internalized and controlled, which makes the moments when Jason does break down all the more powerful. GretaLee's Anne is perhaps the film's most complex character, and Lee navigates that complexity with remarkable skill. Anne is intelligent, observant, and increasingly willing to make hard choices, but Lee ensures we see the cost of those choices. There's a steeliness that emerges in Anne as the situation deteriorates, but it's always tempered by visible love for her family and grief for the normal life that's been lost. Lee excels at showing internal conflict, making Anne's decision-making process visible even when she's not speaking. The chemistry between Moura and Lee is essential to the film's success. Their relationship feels lived in and authentic, showing the kind of partnership that's been tested by years of marriage and parenting. They have shorthand, they can communicate with looks, and they can also hurt each other in ways only long-term partners can. The script gives them several key scenes to work through their different approaches to their situation, and both actors bring nuance to these exchanges, avoiding the trap of making either character simply right or wrong. Noah Alexander Sosnovsky and Riley Chung bring naturalism to their roles as Graham and Ruth. Child performances can often feel forced or overly coached, but both young actors seem genuinely present in their scenes, reacting authentically to the extreme circumstances. Their sibling dynamic, the bickering that gradually gives way to genuine mutual support, feels earned rather than scripted. The film wisely gives them their own emotional arcs independent of their parents, showing how the crisis affects them differently and how they develop their own coping mechanisms. To fully appreciate what The Last House achieves, it's useful to consider it in the context of similar films. The domestic entrapment narrative has become something of a subgenre, with recent examples including 10 Cloverfield Lane, Vivarium, and even, in a very different register, pandemic lockdown films like Locked Down. The Last House distinguishes itself from many of these through its focus on family dynamics rather than interpersonal thriller elements. Unlike 10 Cloverfield Lane, where the threat comes partly from within the potentially dangerous captor, here the threat is entirely external, allowing the family to function as a unit facing outward challenges rather than suspecting each other. This creates a different kind of tension, less paranoid, more about endurance and adaptation. Compared to Vivarium, which uses its impossible suburban trap as surreal social commentary, The Last House is more grounded and realistic in its portrayal of how people might actually respond to inexplicable circumstances. It's less interested in abstract metaphor and more focused on practical and emotional survival. The film also invites comparison to home invasion and siege narratives, though it inverts those conventions. Rather than defending against intruders, the family is defending against, what? Absence. Incomprehensible force. This ambiguity creates a different flavor of dread than more conventional siege films. In the broader landscape of environmental and apocalyptic cinema, The Last House is more intimate and smaller scale than films like The Day After Tomorrow, or Don't Look Up, but shares their interest in how environmental catastrophe affects ordinary people. It has more in common with quieter, more character-focused disaster films like Take Shelter, which similarly explores the psychological impact of anticipating catastrophe. Cultural resonance. The film in our moment. The Last House arrives at a particular cultural moment that inevitably shapes how it's received. Made before but released after the COVID-19 pandemic fundamentally changed how we think about lockdowns, confinement, and social isolation, the film cannot help but resonate with recent collective experience. The scenes of families trapped in their homes, trying to maintain routines and normalcy while cut off from the outside world, will feel uncomfortably familiar to anyone who lived through pandemic lockdowns. The strategies the Delgados employ, establishing schedules, creating designated spaces for different activities, finding ways to make confinement bearable, mirror strategies many real families developed. However, the film also engages with longer-term anxieties that predate and extend beyond the pandemic. The sense that the world outside is changing in fundamental, possibly irreversible ways speaks to climate anxiety. The feeling of being powerless in the face of large-scale forces beyond individual control resonates with various contemporary crises. The question of how to maintain hope and purpose when the future is uncertain has become a defining challenge of the early 21st century. The film's ambiguous approach to these themes will either enhance or limit its cultural staying power. By not tying its scenario too closely to specific real-world events or problems, it achieves a kind of universality. The situation can serve as a metaphor for various anxieties. However, some viewers may find this lack of specificity frustrating, wishing the film took clearer stances on the issues it invokes. Beyond the production design, which stands as the film's primary technical achievement, The Last House shows both competence and occasional limitation in its technical execution. The editing, by editor name, if known, maintains appropriate pacing for a slow-burn thriller. The film takes its time establishing characters and situation before accelerating in the second and third acts. The editorial choices support the sense of time passing and accumulating pressure without allowing the pace to drag. The visual effects, as noted earlier, are a mixed bag. Some of the more ambitious sequences, particularly those revealing the scope of what's happening outside, show their budgetary constraints. The digital effects don't always integrate seamlessly with the live-action photography. However, the effects work is more successful when used sparingly or in partial reveals. The film's most effective moments often combine practical effects, the degrading house, with minimal digital enhancement. The makeup and costume departments deserve credit for the detailed work of showing how the characters' appearances change over the months of confinement. Hair grows out, clothes become more worn and makeshift, and there's a gradual but noticeable shift from the groomed appearances of the opening scenes to the more ragged look of the later sections. The ending, resolution or ambiguity. Without venturing into specific spoilers, the film's conclusion will likely prove divisive. After building tension and mystery for most of its runtime, The Last House must decide whether to provide clear answers and resolution or embrace ambiguity. The approach taken is somewhere in the middle. There is a climax and a resolution of sorts, but many questions remain unanswered. The film provides enough closure for emotional satisfaction. We learn the fate of the family and have a sense of whether their ordeal has meaning, but maintains ambiguity about the larger situation and its implications. This choice is consistent with the film's priorities throughout. It has always been more interested in the Delgado's specific journey than in comprehensive world building or explanation. Viewers seeking a fully mapped out scenario with clear rules and explanations will likely be frustrated. Those willing to accept mystery and focus on the human story will find the ending more satisfying. The final images and the return of the narrator's voice create a frame for the entire story, suggesting we've been hearing a specific account of this crisis rather than experiencing it objectively. This narrational strategy opens questions about perspective and memory that add interesting layers to a rewatch. Strengths, weaknesses, and overall impact. The Last House succeeds most fully as a family drama under extreme circumstances. The relationships between Jason, Anne, Graham, and Ruth are the film's beating heart, and the performances bringing these characters to life are universally strong. For viewers primarily interested in watching a family navigate impossible challenges with psychological realism and emotional authenticity, the film delivers. As a science fiction film, it's more mixed. The conceptual premise is intriguing, and the early development of the mystery is effective. However, the explanations provided are somewhat unsatisfying, and the world building is inconsistent. The film seems more interested in using sci-fi trappings to create a scenario for human drama than in rigorously exploring the implications of its premise. As an environmental or political allegory, it's suggestive but underdeveloped. The themes are present and the resonance with contemporary anxieties is real, but the film doesn't push deep enough into these ideas to make profound statements. It's content to evoke and suggest rather than analyze and argue. The technical execution is generally strong, with exceptional production design compensating for occasionally weak visual effects. Leterrier's direction finds the right balance between intimate character work and larger-scale genre elements, even if budget constraints sometimes limit the ambition. Perhaps most significantly, The Last House captures something true about living with uncertainty and raising children in unstable times. The specific scenario may be science fiction, but the emotions, the difficult choices, the attempts to maintain normalcy in the face of crisis, these feel authentic and resonant. The Last House doesn't achieve the perfect synthesis of intimate drama and high-concept science fiction that it reaches for. The genre elements in the family story don't always integrate seamlessly, and the film's reluctance to fully commit to either the explanatory demands of sci-fi or the thematic depth of serious allegory creates occasional frustration. However, what the film gets right, the human element, the performances, the emotional authenticity of a family under impossible pressure, it gets very right indeed. WagnerMoura and GretaLee anchor the film with empathetic, nuanced performances.
In trying times, environmental, social, political, we need stories that help us process our anxieties and imagine how we might endure. The Last House offers one such story. It's not perfect, but it's heartfelt, thoughtful, and ultimately hopeful about human capacity for adaptation and survival. It recognizes both the fragility and the resilience of family bonds, both the limitations and the possibilities of human ingenuity. The film's willingness to sit with ambiguity, to resist easy answers, feels appropriate for a moment when clear answers to our largest challenges remain elusive. Like the Delgados, we're all navigating unprecedented circumstances with incomplete information, making the best choices we can, trying to protect what matters while preparing for an uncertain future. The Last House may be silly in some respects, as the original review notes, but it has a stabilizing sense of how life actually goes on when everything ends. That insight alone makes it worth the journey into this particular vision, a domestic apocalypse. It's a film that understands that the end of the world, should it come, will still involve dirty dishes, sibling squabbles, difficult conversations, and small moments of connection that make survival worth the effort. The Last House is a solid, thoughtful genre film elevated by exceptional performances and grounded by genuine emotional insight. It may not answer all its own questions or fully deliver on all its thematic promises, but it succeeds where it matters most in showing us recognizable humans facing the unimaginable and finding ways to endure. In a roundabout, meta sort of way, The Last House puts a genuinely terrifying question to its viewers. How long would you last?
This question hangs over every frame of Louis Leterrier's high-concept survival thriller, creating an uncomfortable intimacy between the film and its audience. Unlike many disaster films that allow us to maintain comfortable distance from the catastrophe unfolding on screen, The Last House forces a more personal reckoning. The scenario it presents is simultaneously fantastic and uncomfortably plausible, tapping into primal fears about loss of control, confinement, and the fragility of the systems we depend on. How long would you last? You, who chose to watch The Last House and not The Exterminating Angel, the Louis Buñuel classic in which societal rules break down when bourgeois dinner guests find that they are unable to withdraw from the salon area, would you be capable of adjusting to survival mode? This comparison to Buñuel's 1962 masterpiece is both flattering and damning for The Last House. It positions the film within a distinguished lineage of inexplicable entrapment narratives, while simultaneously highlighting how far short it falls of that classic surrealist brilliance and savage social commentary. Where Buñuel used his impossible scenario to dissect class pretensions and social conventions with surgical precision, The Last House aims for something more accessible, more commercially palatable, and ultimately less profound. The nightmare scenario, when home becomes prison. The film's premise is deceptively simple but effectively disturbing. How long would you hold out if you tried to leave your home one day but found that all the doors wouldn't open? That the cracks in any window you tried to break would immediately repair themselves. This initial setup is one of the film's strongest elements, presenting its central mystery with elegant economy. There's something deeply unsettling about familiar objects, doors, windows, the basic architecture of home suddenly becoming hostile or uncooperative. The self-repairing windows are a particularly nice touch, suggesting not just physical barrier but active opposition to escape attempts. It transforms the home from sanctuary to prison in an instant, inverting our most basic assumptions about the spaces we inhabit. The film wisely takes time with these early discovery scenes, allowing characters and viewers to process the impossibility of what's happening. We watch as Jason tries doors, tests windows, attempts increasingly forceful methods of escape. The growing panic as each attempt fails registers authentically, thanks largely to WagnerMoura's grounded performance. There's a progression from confusion to frustration to fear that feels psychologically genuine. That there was no Wi-Fi or phone service, so you had trouble determining how widespread the problem was. This additional layer of isolation is crucial to the film's effectiveness. In our hyper-connected age, the sudden loss of internet and phone connectivity might be as distressing as physical confinement itself. We've become so accustomed to instant access to information and communication that its absence creates profound disorientation. The inability to determine the scope of the crisis is particularly anxiety-inducing. Is this affecting just one house? The neighborhood? The entire city? The whole world? This uncertainty prevents the characters from contextualizing their situation, from making informed decisions about how to respond. They're operating in an information vacuum, forced to guess at the nature and extent of what they're facing. That all the neighbors you could see from your window were in the same situation and communicating with one another via hand-scrawled messages. This detail brilliantly captures both the possibility of community and its limitations under these circumstances. The neighbors can see each other, can exchange basic information and moral support, but they're fundamentally isolated, each family unit sealed in its own container. The hand-scrawled messages are a clever low-tech solution that also serves as effective visual storytelling. We see optimism give way to desperation in these messages over time, tracking the collective psychological deterioration of the neighborhood through evolving handwriting and increasingly bleak content. It's reminiscent of social media during lockdown, but stripped down to its most basic form: humans trying to maintain connection despite barriers. Your electricity might go down, your food supplies might run low. It would be like the COVID-19 pandemic without fresh air, connectivity or groceries. This comparison to the COVID-19 pandemic is unavoidable, even though the film was conceived before that global crisis. For audiences watching in a post-pandemic world, The Last House will inevitably resonate with recent lived experience of lockdown, isolation, and the strange psychological effects of extended confinement. However, the film amplifies these experiences to nightmarish extremes, removing the escape valves, outdoor walks, delivery services, internet connection that made pandemic lockdowns bearable. The self-interrogation, what the film makes you consider. That type of self-interrogation is ultimately more interesting than anything in the movie, which focuses on one household's persistence and ingenuity. This is a crucial and honest observation. The Last House functions most effectively not as a fully realized dramatic work in itself, but as a prompt for viewers to conduct their own thought experiments. What would I do in this situation? How would my family respond? Do I have the skills, temperament, and resources to survive extended confinement? Would my relationship strengthen or fracture under such pressure? These questions follow you out of the theater, continuing to percolate long after specific plot points have faded. The film's greatest achievement may be creating a scenario compelling enough to provoke this kind of reflection, even if the execution of that scenario is sometimes lacking. The self-interrogation also extends to practical considerations. Do you know how to purify water? Could you grow food indoors? How would you ration supplies? What skills do you possess that would be valuable in a survival situation? For many viewers, the honest answer to these questions is humbling. We've become so dependent on complex systems and specialized expertise that most of us would be woefully unprepared for true self-sufficiency. The Delgado family, idealized or realistic, the four main characters are aided by a conspicuous lack of friction. To extend the Tolstoy line, all happy families are alike, but the family that's going to endure until it's the last house had better be the happiest. This observation cuts to one of the film's central weaknesses. The Delgado family is almost too functional, too harmonious to be entirely believable. While the script makes gestures toward conflict, Jason's unemployment creates some tension, the children bicker, Anne and Jason occasionally disagree on strategy. These conflicts are generally mild and quickly resolved. In reality, extended confinement and life-threatening stress would likely bring latent family dysfunctions to the surface. Old resentments would resurface. Personality clashes would intensify. Different coping mechanisms and stress responses would create friction. The film largely avoids this messier psychological reality in favor of presenting a family that can effectively unite against external threat. This choice makes the film more uplifting but less psychologically complex. We get a somewhat sanitized version of survival, where love and cooperation triumph without the darker possibilities: mental breakdown, destructive conflict, the potential for violence even within families being seriously explored. For some viewers, this will make the film more palatable. For others, it represents a missed opportunity for deeper, darker drama. The Tolstoyan reference is apt. Tolstoy's famous opening line of Anna Karenina, "All happy families are alike, each unhappy family is unhappy in its own way," suggests that functional families share common characteristics while dysfunction takes infinite forms. The Last House seems to argue that in extreme circumstances, you need that baseline of happiness and functionality to survive. The interesting dysfunctional family might make for better drama, but they'd probably tear themselves apart before external threats could destroy them. Skills and resources. The Delgado's advantages. The father, Jason WagnerMoura, has training as an engineer and is an experienced fisherman. Both skills come in handy when it's time to lure small mammals from outdoors. The film stacks the deck in the Delgado's favor by giving them an almost suspiciously useful set of skills. Jason's engineering background allows him to devise ingenious solutions to practical problems: water collection, structural reinforcement, makeshift tools and devices. His fishing experience translates to the grim work of catching small animals for food, a skill that proves essential when supplies run low. WagnerMoura brings genuine intelligence to these scenes, portraying Jason as someone who thinks through problems methodically. We see him planning, calculating, testing hypotheses. It's a more cerebral kind of action hero, someone whose superpower is applied knowledge rather than physical prowess. Moura's performance keeps these sequences grounded. We believe Jason could actually accomplish these feats because Moura plays him as capable but not superhuman, working through trial and error rather than having immediate solutions. Animal lovers should stay far, far away from this movie. This parenthetical warning is well advised. The film doesn't shy away from the brutal reality of survival, including the necessity of killing animals for food when other sources are exhausted. These scenes are not gratuitous, but they are unflinching. For viewers with strong feelings about animal welfare, these sequences will be deeply uncomfortable.
The inclusion of these elements represents an interesting choice. The filmmakers could have elided this aspect of survival or handled it obliquely. By showing it directly, they commit to a certain level of realism about what extreme circumstances might require. It's a reminder that survival often involves crossing lines you'd never consider in normal circumstances, doing things that conflict with your values because the alternative is starvation. The mother, Anne GretaLee, has a green thumb that proves useful even without direct sunlight. Anne's gardening skills become increasingly vital as the film progresses. GretaLee plays Anne as observant and adaptable, someone who can take her existing knowledge and apply it to unprecedented circumstances. The indoor gardening sequences are among the film's most interesting, showing the painstaking work of cultivating food in suboptimal conditions. Lee brings quiet determination to the role. Her Anne is not flashy or dramatic, she's methodical, practical, focused on what needs to be done. It's a performance built on small moments, the concentration on her face as she tends plants, the way she carefully rations and preserves food, the controlled fear when she realizes supplies are running lower than anticipated. The character also serves as emotional barometer for the family. Anne is often the first to recognize when someone is struggling, the one who tries to maintain not just physical survival but psychological well-being. Lee navigates this role with subtlety, showing Anne's own stress while portraying her efforts to shield the children from the full weight of their situation. The children take their confinement in stride. Ruth Riley Chung busies herself with art. Graham Noah Alexander Sosnowski learns to play piano. The children's adaptability is both the film's most optimistic element and potentially its most unrealistic. Riley Chung and Noah Alexander Sosnowski deliver naturalistic performances that never feel overly precocious or cutesy. They play Ruth and Graham as real kids trying to make sense of an incomprehensible situation. Ruth's turn to art as coping mechanism feels psychologically authentic. Art becomes both distraction and processing tool, a way to express feelings she might not have words for. The film shows her artwork evolving over time, reflecting her changing mental state as the confinement extends. Chung brings a quiet intensity to these creative moments, showing how art becomes Ruth's lifeline. Graham's piano learning is similarly well observed. With unlimited time and nothing else to do, intensive skill development becomes possible. The piano becomes his focus, his accomplishment, his way of imposing order and progress on a situation otherwise defined by stagnation. Sosnowski plays these scenes with focus and determination, showing a child discovering discipline and capability in himself. However, the generally mild psychological impact on both children may strike some viewers as overly optimistic. Real children in such circumstances would likely show more severe stress responses, nightmares, behavioral regression, anxiety disorders. The film acknowledges some of these moments of fear and tears but generally keeps the children more resilient than might be realistic. The material culture of confinement. The home has a solid collection of vinyl, Stevie Wonder, David Bowie, but the scant DVD offerings Just, Annie, and Air Force One are their own form of punishment. These specific details are wonderful character and world-building touches. The vinyl collection suggests the parents' tastes, their cultural values, the life they lived before the crisis. Music becomes crucial for maintaining morale and marking time. The specific artists mention Stevie Wonder, David Bowie suggest eclecticism, sophistication, perhaps a certain generational identity. The DVD situation is both funny and quietly horrifying. Imagine being trapped indefinitely with only 2 movies to watch. The specific titles are perfect: Annie, an aggressively cheerful musical about optimism in the face of hardship, and Air Force One, an action thriller about a president fighting to save his family and country from terrorists. Both take on strange new resonances when watched repeatedly in confinement. These details ground the film in material reality. This isn't a generic home, it's a specific place with specific objects that shape how the family experiences their confinement. The film understands that in isolation, every object becomes more significant. Books, games, music, and yes, even terrible DVD options become precious resources for maintaining sanity. The contrast between the ample vinyl and scarce DVDs also suggests something about the family's values and how they've been caught off guard. They've invested in music but happen to have few movies on hand. It's the kind of arbitrary limitation that real life imposes but that movies often smooth over. The explanation problem: what's causing this? What's sealing everyone in? The Last House, written by Matthew Robinson, Good Luck, Have Fun, Don't Die, and directed by Louis Leterrier, who helped inaugurate the Transporter franchise, splits the difference between willful fuzziness and unsatisfying explanations. This is perhaps the film's most significant flaw from a pure storytelling perspective. The movie can't seem to decide whether it wants to embrace mystery or provide concrete answers. The result is an uncomfortable middle ground that satisfies neither approach. Matthew Robinson's screenplay teases explanations throughout, offering clues and suggestions without committing to a coherent framework. For viewers who can accept mystery and ambiguity, this might be tolerable. But for those expecting the satisfying logic of well-crafted science fiction, it's frustrating. Louis Leterrier's direction doesn't fully compensate for the script's evasions. Leterrier, known for action-heavy franchises like Transporter and Fast and Furious, brings visual energy to the proceedings but can't paper over the conceptual gaps. His background in practical, physics-based action actually works against him. Herith film's unclear rules and inconsistent logic clash with his more grounded directorial instincts. Obvious issues raised by the premise are barely addressed. Was almost no one in the neighborhood, or on the planet, outside when the Great Lockup occurred. We meet only a lone jogger. This is an excellent example of the film's world-building problems. In any crisis event, you'd expect to find people caught in transition zone, people at home, others at work, others outside, others traveling. The film's premise seems to require that nearly everyone was inside their respective homes at the moment of the lockup, which strains credibility unless we posit some kind of mass compulsion that drove people indoors first. The lone jogger we meet raises as many questions as he answers. How did he survive outside? What has he seen? How does the barrier work for someone who wasn't inside a structure? These questions aren't satisfactorily answered, and the character seems to exist more to provide brief outside perspective than because his presence makes logical sense. A more rigorous screenplay would have thought through these implications and either addressed them directly or carefully avoided raising questions it couldn't answer. The Last House does neither, instead hoping viewers won't think too hard about the mechanics of its premise, the physics of the fantastic. And while, in theory, anything can happen in science fiction, The Last House hasn't made sense of its own physics. This criticism cuts to the heart of what separates effective science fiction from sloppy fantasy. Good science fiction establishes rules for its speculative elements and then plays fair with those rules. The rules don't have to be scientifically accurate to real-world physics. They can be entirely invented, but they need to be internally consistent. The Last House establishes some apparent rules: windows self-repair, doors won't open, some kind of barrier prevents exit, but then seems to violate or ignore its own parameters when convenient for the plot. Objects and people can apparently enter from outside, small animals can be lured in, the jogger exists, but the mechanics of how this works are never clarified. The film would be stronger if it committed to either rigorous internal logic or complete mystical ambiguity. Instead, it tries to have things both ways, providing just enough pseudo-scientific explanation to invite logical scrutiny while keeping things vague enough to avoid commitment to any particular framework. At first it appears that an ominous force is controlling the atmosphere, the weather, and the almost magnetized beating of water droplets on window panes.
These early visual effects and phenomena are genuinely creepy. The uncanny behavior of water droplets, the atmospheric disturbances, the sense of natural law being subtly violated, these create effective dread. Leterrier and his cinematographer deserve credit for making these moments viscerally unsettling. The restraint shown in these early sequences is admirable. Rather than immediately showing massive CGI spectacle, the film builds unease through small wrongnesses, subtle departures from normalcy. It's a "something is wrong with this picture" approach that engages the viewer's pattern recognition and generates organically growing dread. You can practically hear the studio executives say, "But we will have big, tentacled monsters, right?" This devastating aside suggests exactly what went wrong. There's a palpable sense that the film couldn't trust its more subtle, atmospheric approach and felt compelled to deliver conventional genre payoffs. The shift from eerie ambiguity to more concrete and more conventional threats feels like commercial compromise rather than organic narrative development. The imagined studio note is funny but also sad, representing the eternal tension between artistic vision and commercial demands. The smaller, stranger, more ambiguous film lurking inside The Last House might have been more satisfying, but it also might have been harder to market, harder to sell to audiences expecting clear genre thrills. When the film does deliver its big reveals, they often feel grafted on rather than inevitable. Tentacled monsters, or whatever specific threat the film presents. This review avoids detailed spoilers, represent a more conventional, more easily marketed kind of danger than the psychological and existential dread the early film generates. Thematic confusion. What is this movie about? Thematically, the movie likewise can't commit. It's half eco-parable, half simple-minded moral lesson. This thematic confusion permeates the entire film. Is The Last House a warning about environmental catastrophe? A meditation on family resilience? A survival thriller? A metaphor for pandemic isolation? All of these readings are possible, but none are fully developed. The ecological elements are present but underbaked. There are suggestions that climate change or environmental collapse might be implicated in what's happening, but the film never commits to this framework or explores its implications. It invokes these ideas to add contemporary relevance without doing the work of genuinely engaging with them. The simple-minded moral lesson seems to be something about family strength, ingenuity, and perseverance. The Delgados survive because they work together, because they maintain hope, because they adapt. This is not an invalid theme, but it's executed with little complexity. We don't see them genuinely tested in ways that might complicate this message. They don't face moral dilemmas that might force them to compromise their values. They remain fundamentally good people doing their best, which is admirable but not dramatically complex. A more ambitious film would interrogate its own themes more rigorously. What does survival cost? What lines might good people cross when pushed far enough? What does family loyalty mean when resources are scarce and stakes are existential? The Last House raises these questions but rarely pushes past comfortable answers. The environmental parable, if that's what it is, also lacks clarity. Is nature punishing humanity? Are we seeing some kind of planetary defense mechanism? Is this the Earth's way of forcing human civilization to contract, to minimize its footprint? These ideas hover around the edges of the film without being explicitly engaged. Leterrier's direction, action instincts in an intimate setting. Louis Leterrier's involvement is both an asset and a liability. His experience with action franchises gives him technical competence and the ability to stage compelling sequences. He knows how to build tension, how to choreograph complex scenes, how to maintain visual interest. However, The Last House requires different skills than the Transporter or Fast and Furious films. It needs psychological nuance, patience, character depth, qualities not typically associated with Leterrier's previous work. To his credit, he attempts to adapt his approach to the material, and there are sequences that demonstrate real growth as a filmmaker. The intimate scenes between family members show Leterrier working in a different register than his action films. He gives actors room to work, allows scenes to breathe, doesn't feel compelled to cut frantically or inject artificial energy. These quieter moments are often the film's most effective. However, when the film shifts into more conventional genre territory, action sequences, reveals, confrontations with external threats, Leterrier seems more comfortable but also more conventional. These sequences feel more like his previous work, competent but not particularly distinctive. The unique potential of the premise gets subordinated to familiar genre mechanics. Performance is the film's saving grace. If The Last House works at all, it's largely due to the committed performances of its lead actors. WagnerMoura and GretaLee bring depth and authenticity to roles that could have been simple survival archetypes. They create a believable marriage, a credible family unit, characters we can invest in emotionally even when the plot fails them. Moura's Jason is intelligent without being superhuman, scared without being paralyzed, resourceful without being unrealistically capable. He's a recognizable type of dad trying to protect his family, leveraging his skills and knowledge, holding himself together through force of will. Moura finds the humanity in this, showing us the fear beneath the competence, the moments of doubt that Jason can't let his family see. GretaLee's Anne is equally nuanced. She's the family's emotional core, the one maintaining not just physical household functions but psychological well-being. Lee shows the weight of this responsibility without making Anne a martyr. She's doing what needs to be done, sometimes resenting it, sometimes finding purpose in it, always focused on getting her family through. The child actors, Chung and Noah Alexander Sosnowski, avoid the usual pitfalls of child performances in genre films. They're neither cutesy nor overly mature, but rather recognizably kids trying to process and adapt to incomprehensible circumstances. They're developing coping mechanisms. Riff's art, Graham's piano feel like real strategies real kids might employ. The family chemistry is the film's greatest achievement. We believe these people know and love each other, have history together, would fight to protect one another. This emotional foundation makes us care about their survival even when the plot mechanics frustrate. The COVID context, accidental resonance. While conceived before the pandemic, The Last House has become impossible to watch without COVID-19 context. The experience of lockdown, of home becoming both sanctuary and prison, of social isolation punctuated by window-based communication with neighbors aren't just fictional scenarios anymore. They're lived experience for much of the global audience. This accidental relevance cuts both ways. For some viewers, the film's scenario will feel too close to recent trauma, too reminiscent of genuinely difficult times. The entertainment value of watching a family trapped in their home may be limited for people who recently experienced modified versions of that reality. For others, the film might offer a way to process pandemic experience through the distancing lens of genre fiction. By amplifying lockdown conditions to impossible extremes, The Last House allows viewers to engage with isolation anxiety in a framework that's clearly fictional, clearly other than their own experience, even while resonating with it. The film doesn't acknowledge pandemic experience directly, it couldn't, given production timelines, but the parallels are inescapable. The psychological effects of extended isolation, the strange suspension of normal time, the difficulty of maintaining routines and purpose, the way small family conflicts amplify in confinement, all of these will be immediately recognizable to pandemic survivors. Beyond performances, the film's technical elements are variable. The production design, as mentioned, is consistently strong. The house feels like a real space that evolves believably under the pressures placed on it. The gradual accumulation of modifications, damage, and wear creates a tangible sense of time passing and conditions deteriorating. The cinematography has moments of genuine artistry, particularly in the early atmospheric sequences where something feels subtly wrong with the world outside. The framing often emphasizes the confining nature of the house, using doorways and windows as frames within frames, creating visual claustrophobia. The visual effects are more problematic. The smaller scale effects, the self-repairing windows, the strange behavior of water and atmosphere are generally convincing. The larger spectacle moments, particularly later in the film, show their budgetary constraints more clearly. Digital effects don't always integrate seamlessly with practical photography, occasionally pulling viewers out of the experience. The sound design creates effective atmosphere, using ambient sounds and silence to build unease. The score, by composer name, if known, supports rather than overwhelms, though it sometimes telegraphs emotional beats that might have been more effective with more subtlety. Editing maintains generally good pacing, allowing the film to breathe during character moments while maintaining momentum during more action-oriented sequences. The passage of time is communicated effectively through visual shortcut, changing seasons visible through windows, evolving conditions inside the house, physical changes in the characters. The Last House exists within a specific subgenre of entrapment narratives, and understanding its place in that lineage clarifies both its achievements and failures. The Buñuel comparison is instructive. The Exterminating Angel used its impossible scenario for savage social satire, watching bourgeois pretensions crumble under pressure. The Last House has no such satirical edge. It's more interested in resilience than social critique. More recent comparisons might include 10 Cloverfield Lane, which mixed domestic entrapment with external threat, or Vivarium, which used impossible suburban imprisonment for surreal social commentary. The Last House is less psychologically dark than either, more interested in survival ingenuity than existential horror. The film also evokes pandemic lockdown cinema films like Lockdown or Songbird that tried to process COVID-19 experience through fiction. The Last House is less explicitly topical but may resonate more deeply by approaching similar themes through genre metaphor rather than literal representation. In the broader survival thriller genre, the film is more grounded and character-focused than many entries. It's less interested in action spectacle than in practical problem-solving and family dynamics. This is both strength and weakness. It provides more emotional substance but perhaps less visceral excitement than some viewers expect. Perhaps the most interesting aspect of The Last House is what it reveals about why we're drawn to disaster and survival narratives. These stories allow us to test ourselves imaginatively, to rehearse for catastrophe in safe fictional spaces. The "how long would you last?" question the film poses isn't idle curiosity. It reflects genuine anxiety about our capabilities, our preparedness, our resilience. In an age of climate crisis, pandemic, political instability, and social fragmentation, many people carry low-level dread about whether they could handle serious disruption to normal life. Films like The Last House offer both comfort and challenge. They're comforting because they show recognizable people surviving extraordinary circumstances, suggesting that we too might find hidden reserves of strength and capability. They're challenging because they force us to confront our dependencies, our vulnerabilities, our lack of practical skills that previous generations took for granted. The film also engages with questions about what matters in extremis. Stripped of the usual markers of success and status, what remains? Family relationships, practical knowledge, adaptability, cooperation has become the metrics of value. There's something both frightening and liberating about imagining life reduced to such fundamentals. You might outlast The Last House, but there are better ways to kill time indoors. This concluding zinger captures the review's measured disappointment. The film is watchable, occasionally compelling, but ultimately underwhelming given its premise and talent involved. However, this assessment may be somewhat harsh. The Last House, despite its flaws, offers more substance than many genre films. The performances alone elevate it above standard survival thriller fare. The questions it raises about family, survival, and preparedness linger beyond its runtime, even if the film itself doesn't fully explore them. For viewers willing to accept ambiguity and inconsistency, focusing on the human drama rather than rigorous world-building, The Last House offers a tense, emotionally engaging experience. The family's journey, grounded by excellent performances, provides sufficient reason to invest attention. For viewers demanding logical coherence, thematic depth, and satisfying explanations, the film will frustrate. Its evasions and inconsistencies undermine what could have been a more powerful experience. The film occupies an uncomfortable middle ground, too ambitious to be simple genre entertainment, too compromised to achieve genuine artistic or thematic distinction. It's a would-be prestige genre film that couldn't fully commit to either prestige or genre, resulting in something that partially satisfies on both fronts without excelling at either. The Last House ultimately works better as prompt than as fully realized film. Its central question, how long would you last, proves more compelling than its answers. The scenario it creates invites sustained reflection on survival, family, preparedness, and resilience, even if the film itself doesn't explore these themes as deeply as it might. The performances provide an emotional anchor that the script sometimes doesn't deserve. WagnerMoura and GretaLee create fully human characters navigating impossible circumstances with believable combinations of fear, ingenuity, and determination. Their work, along with strong child performances and excellent production design, makes the film consistently watchable even when the plot falters. The film's reluctance to commit either rigorous explanation or sustained mystery, to ecological parable or simple survival thriller, to dark psychological complexity or uplifting family drama prevents it from achieving real distinction. It wants to be multiple things simultaneously and ends up being none of them completely. Yet there's something valuable in the film's very existence, in its willingness to engage with contemporary anxieties through genre frameworks. We need stories that help us process climate dread, isolation anxiety, and fears about civilizational fragility. The Last House is an imperfect vehicle for this processing, but it's not without merit. The film asks how long we would last. Perhaps the better question is how long we'll remember it. The answer is probably, not very long. This isn't a film that will haunt you or demand revisiting. But for its runtime, it offers sufficient tension, genuine emotion, and thought-provoking scenarios to justify the viewing experience. In an era of environmental anxiety and social fragmentation, we could do worse than spending time with the Delgado family, watching them adapt, endure, and maintain their humanity in the face of incomprehensible crisis. Their journey may not provide all the answers we seek, but it reminds us that even when the world outside makes no sense, we can still find purpose in protecting those we love and maintaining hope for an uncertain future. The Last House, a film that sneaks onto the platform with minimal fanfare but maximum ambition. This is going to be a comprehensive look at what works, what doesn't, and why this movie might be exactly what you need for your next streaming night, or alternatively, why you should skip it entirely. We'll be exploring the performances, the themes, the pandemic subtext, and whether this survival thriller delivers on its promising premise.
Most of us aren't truly ready for films that directly cover the recent horrors of COVID and, well, why would we be? This is the uncomfortable truth that hangs over so much contemporary cinema right now. We're in this weird transitional period where filmmakers want to process what we all went through, but audiences are still too raw, too exhausted by the reality to want to relive it through fiction. It's a challenging position for storytellers who feel compelled to address the defining global event of the past several years but can't find an audience willing to meet them there emotionally. There was a need back in 2021 for something strict and journalistic like Matthew Hyman's excellent documentary, The First Wave, and there have been other variously illuminating docs since, but it's been tough for narrative storytellers to address and confront, and even tougher for audiences to engage. Documentary has had more success because it offers the distance of real reportage, of historical record. We can watch documentaries about the pandemic because they're framed as education, as witness testimony, as important historical record. But fiction asks us to emotionally invest in recreations of trauma we're still processing. That's a much harder sell. The box office numbers don't lie. Films that directly engage with pandemic experience have struggled to find audiences. People stayed away in droves, and you can't entirely blame them. After being forced to live through lockdowns, social isolation, fear of disease, economic uncertainty, and loss, who wants to pay money to watch actors pretend to experience the same things? It's partly why Ari Aster's intermittently excellent 2020 set satire, Eddington, fizzled at the box office, released 5 years after the pandemic began but still 5 years too soon. Now, I want to pause here and acknowledge that some of you might be wondering when exactly we'll be ready for these stories. The honest answer is probably different for everyone. Some people might never want pandemic fiction. Others might be ready now. Most of us probably fall somewhere in the middle, willing to engage with these themes if they're handled with sufficient artistry, insight, or entertainment value. The distance of time will help, certainly, but so will the skill of the storytellers brave enough to tackle this material. The most effective ways in have usually been through the back door. This is the key insight for understanding The Last House, and why it might succeed where more direct approaches have failed. Rather than literally depicting the pandemic, smart filmmakers are finding ways to explore the emotional, psychological, and social impacts through genre frameworks, through metaphor, through settings that feel adjacent to but distinct from our lived experience. Mike Leigh's 2024 drama, Hard Truths, might have only mentioned the pandemic once and included just one mask, but its portrait of a psychologically fractured, permanently on edge woman, terrified of what lies outside her chillingly sterile house, was very much about the difficult after effects of the disease.
Lee understood that you don't need to show lockdowns to explore lockdown psychology. You don't need masks and ventilators to examine how collective trauma reshapes individual psychology. The pandemic became part of the emotional texture of the film without being the explicit subject. Next week sees the release of The End of Oak Street, an 80s set fantasy adventure about a family trying to survive a prehistoric invasion from the safety of their own home, and this week, sneaked out by Netflix just days before, is The Last House, another high-concept genre tale that sees homes across the world locked off from the outside as something terrifying attacks. Notice the pattern here. These films are all processing pandemic experience, the confinement, the family pressure cooker dynamics, the outside threat, the makeshift survival, but through fantastical frameworks that provide emotional distance. The Last House is particularly interesting in this regard because it so clearly evokes pandemic lockdown while being completely different in its specifics. The homes are sealed by mysterious forces rather than government mandate. The threat is supernatural rather than viral. But the emotional beats, the psychological pressure points, the family dynamics under stress, these are all recognizable from recent lived experience. Now let's get into the actual film itself. We're focused on just one home, inhabited by a financially struggling Seattle family, although the film is clearly shot in the UK, note the extremely British brickwork. This detail made me smile because it's so obviously true once you notice it. American films shot in Britain or Canada always have these little tells: the architecture, the light quality, the vegetation. It's a budget consideration, of course, but it creates this slightly uncanny feeling where the setting doesn't quite match the supposed location. The family at the center consists of Jason, played by WagnerMoura fresh off his recent Oscar nomination for Emilia Perez, and Anne, played by GretaLee, who broke through with Past Lives. They have 2 children, and they're living on an average suburban street dealing with the normal stresses of contemporary middle-class life. Jason is unemployed, which creates financial pressure and perhaps some wounded pride. The kids are at that age where they're starting to develop independence and push boundaries. It's all very recognizable, very grounded. A torrential pre-Christmas downpour brings with it a nasty twist. The rain has somehow forced everyone inside, some sort of mysterious sealant adding magical power to the water. The premise is established quickly and efficiently. We're not given detailed scientific explanations initially, just the frightening reality that doors won't open, windows won't break, and everyone is suddenly trapped in their homes. It's a nightmare scenario delivered with economical storytelling. Jason and Anne and the 2 children must figure out the initial, milder concerns. Where will the dog shit and without Wi-Fi? What DVDs do we have left? Before days turn into months and eventually even longer, something spoiled by an overeager trailer. These early practical concerns are actually some of the film's strongest moments because they feel so real, so immediately relatable. Of course the first question would be where the dog relieves itself. Of course you'd immediately check what entertainment options you have. These mundane details ground the fantastical premise in authentic human response. The trailer spoiler issue is worth addressing. Modern marketing has this terrible habit of revealing far too much, often showing the entire narrative arc in a 2-minute preview. It robs audiences of discovery and surprise, and it's particularly damaging for films like this that rely on gradually escalating stakes and revelations. If you haven't watched the trailer, I'd recommend going in as blind as possible. The experience of discovering how far this situation extends and how long it lasts is much more impactful if you don't already know. There's a satisfying and relatable itch being scratched in the lighter moments of early makeshift togetherness, that familiarly cozy process of making do with what we have and, in this case, also forcing a family away from the devices. This is where the film most directly taps into something many of us experienced during lockdown. There was, for some people, a strange sort of coziness to those early pandemic days, being forced to slow down, to be present with family, to rediscover simple pleasures and offline entertainment. Obviously this was complicated by fear, uncertainty, and for many people, genuine hardship. But there was also this element of enforced simplicity that some found oddly comforting. The film captures this duality well in these early sequences. There's warmth and togetherness, family bonding over limited resources and shared challenges. But grimness is never far away. The film doesn't let us get too comfortable with the cozy domesticity because it understands that extended confinement and mounting pressure inevitably crack that surface. Elderly neighbors stop appearing at their windows, food becomes harder to eke out and, in a rather shocking chain of events likely to traumatize a certain sensitive subset of viewers, extreme measures are taken when the dog's medication runs out. This progression from mild inconvenience to genuine life or death crisis is well paced. We feel the accumulating weight of the situation, the way small problems compound into larger ones, the way initial optimism gives way to harder calculations. The dog situation is going to be deeply upsetting for some viewers, and the review is right to flag this. Without getting into specific spoilers, the film doesn't shy away from the brutal choices that extended survival scenarios might require. This is admirable from a dramatic standpoint. It shows the filmmakers are willing to take their premise seriously and explore genuinely difficult territory. But it's also going to be a deal breaker for some audience members who can't handle certain content involving animals. Consider this your warning. Then there's the matter of what's outside. The film maintains mystery about the external threat for a considerable portion of the runtime, showing us glimpses and suggestions rather than full reveals. This restraint serves the film well, allowing our imaginations to fill in the gaps and keeping the focus on the family's internal dynamics and immediate survival challenges. The film works best when sticking to a more grounded survival thriller, Mum preserving and reusing food waste while Dad's skills as both engineer and fisherman lead to a nifty sequence of using the oddly unblocked chimney to hunt. These practical survival elements are genuinely engaging. There's something satisfying about watching competent people apply their knowledge to unprecedented circumstances. The resourcefulness on display feels earned rather than miraculous, based on actual skills the characters possess rather than convenient plot developments. The chimney hunting sequence is a particular highlight, showing creative problem solving and making use of established character background. Jason's engineering expertise and fishing experience aren't just character details, they become crucial survival tools. This is smart screenwriting, establishing abilities early that pay off later in organic ways. Even in the apocalypse, gender roles persist. This parenthetical observation is sharp and worth unpacking. The film does fall into somewhat traditional divisions of labor, with Anne handling food preservation and domestic management while Jason tackles the more action-oriented engineering and hunting tasks. Is this realistic to how many families would default to familiar patterns under stress? Probably. Is it also a missed opportunity to explore how crisis might break down traditional gender roles? Also probably. It's not a fatal flaw, but it is noticeable, especially in a film that otherwise tries to bring fresh perspectives to familiar scenarios. As teased by what happens to the family pet, there's also a willingness to embrace the horrible reality of the situation as resources dwindle and mental health starts to disintegrate. The film deserves credit for not soft-pedaling the psychological toll of extended confinement and mounting hopelessness. Characters don't just stay resilient and optimistic because the script needs them to. We see genuine deterioration, genuine desperation, genuine fracturing of relationships under impossible pressure. As the sun threatens to go full, we need to talk about Kevin. Any conservative notion that the film is suggesting family is all we need is swiftly binned. This is an important point. The film flirts with potentially sentimental, family conquers all, messaging but ultimately undermines it by showing how even loving families can break down under sufficient stress. The son's psychological unraveling, his potential for violence, his inability to cope with the situation despite parental love and support, this complicates any simplistic reading of the film as family values propaganda. We need to talk about Kevin reference points to really dark territory, a child becoming genuinely dangerous, parents recognizing they may have lost the ability to reach or control their offspring. If the film goes even partway to that disturbing place, it's showing real courage in exploring the darkest possibilities of its scenario. It's less successful when it becomes a gloopier sci-fi horror, juicy big questions fumbled with unsatisfying and underwritten answers. And here we reach the film's central problem, the issue that keeps it from achieving genuine greatness. The mystery that sustains the first two acts doesn't have a payoff that justifies the build-up. The explanations, when they come, feel half-baked, conceptually muddled, and dramatically unsatisfying. This is an incredibly common problem in high-concept genre films. The premise is strong enough to carry you for an hour, maybe 90 minutes. But eventually, you have to answer the questions you've raised, and those answers either elevate the entire film retroactively or deflate all the tension you've built. The Last House, unfortunately, falls into the latter category. There's something Shyamalan adjacent about so much of the intriguing setup, but the film gradually switches from skirting the highs of Signs to almost reaching the lows of The Happening, What If, Nature. With a sloppy and disappointingly untwisty last act. This comparison is brutally accurate and will resonate with anyone familiar with M. Night Shyamalan's uneven filmography. Signs worked because its family drama was strong enough to carry the film even when the alien invasion elements were somewhat goofy. The Happening, on the other hand, had a premise so fundamentally silly and execution so self-serious that it collapsed into unintentional comedy. The Last House doesn't quite reach The Happening levels of narrative dysfunction, but it does share that film's problem of treating a conceptually thin sci-fi premise with inappropriate gravitas. The "what if nature fought back" angle has been done many times, and unless you bring genuinely fresh insight or execution, it's going to feel derivative and underdeveloped. The lack of a satisfying twist is also disappointing. The film seems to be building towards some kind of revelation that will recontextualize everything we've seen, but what we get instead is more straightforward and less interesting than the mystery suggested. In an era where audiences are extremely genre-savvy and have seen countless variations on these scenarios, you really need to bring something unexpected to stand out. Like so many buzzy genre movies, the initial pull-off. The pitch is left a little dampened by the half-assed follow-through, and writer Matthew Robinson's dialogue is frequently a little too neat and trailer-packaged to rise above cliché. The dialogue issue is significant because it constantly reminds you that you're watching a script rather than observing real people. Characters say things that sound good in trailers but that no actual human would say in crisis situations. "What do? We survive," is uttered within mere seconds of "a monster's real. They are now." These examples are perfect illustrations of the problem. They're the kind of lines that sound punchy in isolation, that work well in marketing materials, but that feel artificial and rightly when delivered in context. Real people in crisis speak more messily, more uncertainly, with more verbal stumbling and incomplete thoughts. This polished, epigrammatic dialogue creates tonal dissonance with the film's attempts at gritty realism. It's a shame because Matthew Robinson clearly has strong conceptual instincts, the premise is solid, the structure generally works, and individual scenes are often well constructed. But the dialogue repeatedly undercuts the film's ambitions, reminding us we're watching a commercial product designed for maximum marketability rather than an authentic exploration of its themes. While there's an above-average sheen to so much of it, Louis Leterrier, the director, is more familiar with studio over streaming fare, having made Clash of the Titans, The Incredible Hulk, and Now You See Me. The film does look more expensive and polished than typical Netflix genre offerings. Leterrier brings genuine craft and visual sophistication from his studio experience. The cinematography is often striking, the production design is detailed and convincing, and there's a general sense of professional competence that elevates the material. However, for a film that eventually most resembles A Quiet Place, the creature design is immediately unmemorable and entirely unscary. This is a crucial failure. A Quiet Place worked in large part because its creatures were distinctive, frightening, and operated according to clear rules that generated suspense. The Last House, creatures, and I'm being deliberately vague to avoid spoilers, lack all these qualities. They're generic CGI threats that could have been pulled from any number of mediocre monster movies. The comparison to A Quiet Place is inevitable once the film reveals its full hand, and it suffers badly in that comparison. John Krasinski's film had clear rules, memorable monsters, and set pieces constructed with genuine tension and craft. The Last House has none of these elements operating at the same level. while the editing of a theoretically ambitious last set-piece is far too scrappy to push us to the edge. The final act should be the film's showcase, the sequence result of various production issues. Perhaps the sequence wasn't fully realized in shooting and had to be salvaged in editing, or perhaps it's simply a case of editorial misjudgment. Whatever the cause, it's a significant problem because it means the film doesn't deliver on its most basic genre obligation, providing a thrilling, satisfying climax. After investing 2 hours in these characters and this situation, we deserve a conclusion that delivers emotional and visceral payoff. What we get instead is muddled and anticlimactic. Now let's talk about the performances, because this is where the film shows both its strengths and its limitations. Moura keeps us on board with some confident leading man command. WagnerMoura is genuinely excellent here, bringing gravitas and emotional authenticity to what could have been a stock protective father role. He's compelling in both the quieter dramatic moments and the more action-oriented sequences. You believe him as an engineer, as a father, as a man trying to hold himself and his family together through sheer force of will. Moura's recent Oscar nomination for Emilia Perez has raised his profile significantly, and this performance shows why he's capable of that level of recognition. He brings layers to Jason. We see the fear he's trying to hide from his family, the guilt over his unemployment, the desperate need to prove his worth through protecting and providing for his loved ones. It's a fully inhabited performance that gives the film an emotional anchor. But a rather unconvincing Lee remains unsteady and either goes too small or too big, admittedly left stranded by a script that gives her a character with very little distinction. This is disappointing because GretaLee is phenomenal in the right material, as past lives so beautifully demonstrated. But here, she seems unable to find the right register for Anne, oscillating between muted underplaying and over-emphatic emotional beats without settling into a consistent characterization. To be fair to Lee, the script doesn't give her much to work with. Anne is underwritten compared to Jason, more a collection of wife and mother functions than a fully realized individual. Where Jason gets his engineering expertise, his fishing background, his clear areas of competence and character definition, Anne gets gardening skills and maternal worry. It's a much thinner character, and even an actor of Lee's caliber struggles to build a compelling performance from such limited material. The unsteadiness in Lee's performance might also reflect the general tonal confusion of the film. When the script can't decide whether it's gritty survival realism or heightened genre thriller, actors are left without clear guidance on how to pitch their performances. Moura manages to navigate this uncertainty, but Lee seems more thrown by it. For 2 actors more recently associated with weightier material, there are worse paycheck roles to take. This is a practical and honest observation. Both Moura and Lee have done prestige work that's earned critical acclaim but probably didn't pay spectacularly. There's nothing wrong with actors taking commercial genre work between more artistically ambitious projects. It pays the bills, maintains visibility, and can actually be creatively rewarding when the material is strong. The question is whether The Last House represents a worthwhile use of their time and talent. For Moura, who gets a meaty lead role and delivers a strong performance, the answer is probably yes. For Lee, stuck in an underwritten role that doesn't showcase her abilities, it's more questionable. And, for a platform that often struggles to produce convincing mockbusters, far worse recent examples, it ranks above their recent dodgy Pixar ripoff and even dodgier, Crawl, ripoff. Netflix has developed a reputation for churning out formulaic genre content that mimics more successful theatrical releases without capturing what made the originals work. Their animated features often feel like direct-to-video knockoffs of Pixar films. Their creature features recycle elements from successful horror thrillers without the craft or originality. The Last House is definitely more accomplished than these bottom-tier Netflix offerings. It has recognizable actors giving committed performances, decent production values, and at least some ambition beyond pure imitation. It's an original concept, even if the execution recalls other films. That puts it in the middle tier of Netflix genre content, not among their rare genuine successes, but well above their most cynical cash grabs. It does in many ways represent the ideal of a Netflix Friday night movie, not good enough to warrant a bigger screen but, if stuck at home for reasons supernatural or not, just about good enough for a low-stakes click. This perfectly captures the film's ultimate value proposition. It's streaming comfort food, moderately engaging, reasonably well made, requiring no particular commitment or deep attention, and ultimately forgettable. There's actually a place for this kind of content in the streaming ecosystem. Not every film needs to be a masterpiece. Sometimes you just want something mildly entertaining to watch on a Friday night when you're too tired for anything demanding. The Last House fits that niche adequately. It's watchable enough to hold attention, competent enough not to actively irritate, but disposable enough that you won't think about it much after it ends. The irony of watching a film about being trapped in your home while you're voluntarily staying in to stream movies is not lost on me, and it probably adds an extra layer of resonance for viewers in similar situations. There's something almost meta about the experience, choosing to watch people forced to stay home while we choose to stay home for entertainment. So where does this leave us with The Last House? It's a film of contradictions and missed opportunities. The premise is strong and clearly resonates with contemporary anxieties about confinement, family pressure, environmental threats, and loss of control. The first two acts build genuine tension through grounded survival details and psychological realism. WagnerMoura delivers a genuinely strong lead performance. The production values are solid. But the film ultimately can't deliver on its promise. The explanations are unsatisfying, the creatures unmemorable, the dialogue too polished and artificial, and the climax poorly executed. It's a film that starts strong and gradually deflates, leaving you with the frustrating sense of what might have been if the back half matched the quality of the setup. For viewers desperately seeking pandemic-adjacent content that processes lockdown experience through genre metaphor, The Last House offers some value. It captures certain truths about confinement, about family dynamics under pressure, about the psychological toll of extended isolation and uncertainty. If you can accept imperfect execution and focus on these thematic elements, there's something worthwhile here. For general audiences just looking for a solid thriller, the results are more mixed. The strong start and Moura's performance make it watchable, but the disappointing resolution and generic creature design mean it never achieves the impact it's reaching for. It's fine, which might be the most damning assessment possible, a film with genuine ambitions that settles for adequacy. I'd recommend The Last House, with significant caveats. If you're a fan of WagnerMoura or high-concept survival thrillers, it's worth a watch. If you're interested in how contemporary films are processing pandemic trauma through genre frameworks, it's a relevant if flawed example. If you need something moderately engaging for a streaming night and aren't too demanding about narrative satisfaction, it'll do the job. But if you're looking for the next, A Quiet Place, or a genuinely innovative take on the survival thriller genre, you'll be disappointed. This is a competent, occasionally compelling film that never quite comes together into something truly special. What did you think of The Last House? Did it work better for you than it did for me? What did you make of the ending and the creature design? And more broadly, how do you feel about films that process pandemic experience through genre metaphor rather than addressing it directly? Drop your thoughts in the comments below because I'm genuinely curious how this one is landing with different viewers. The Last House is Netflix's newest horror release, and it arrives with the kind of premise that makes you sit up. What if the doors of your home simply refused to open? What if the windows shattered and reformed like they were never broken at all? It's the sort of high-concept hook that could headline a horror classic. Unfortunately, The Last House squanders it. This is a movie that will almost certainly claim the #1 spot on Netflix's top 10 chart for a week, generate a flurry of, "Have you seen this yet?" texts, and then vanish from the cultural conversation entirely. It's a frustrating, forgettable ride not because the idea at its center is bad, but because the people behind the camera were far more interested in echoing better films than building something of their own. If you're trying to decide whether The Last House is worth your 2 hours on Netflix tonight, this review breaks down exactly where the movie succeeds, where it collapses, and why a premise this strong deserved so much better.
Instead sit flat, waiting for something to happen rather than generating dread through composition or pacing. It's the classic mismatch of a talented filmmaker working slightly outside their wheelhouse, not incompetent, just miscalibrated for the specific demands of the genre he's stepped into. Matthew Robinson's script. Big ideas, no follow-through. Screenwriter Matthew Robinson deserves credit for the premise itself. It's a genuinely great what-if hook, and high-concept originality is a real asset in a streaming landscape flooded with interchangeable horror content. But a strong hook is only step one, and The Last House is a clear example of a script that never figures out what it wants to say once the hook is established. The screenplay raises interesting questions about isolation, about family, about the thin line between shelter and prison, and then largely abandons them in favor of forward plot momentum. There's no thematic through line that deepens as the film progresses, no idea that gets more complicated or more specific the longer these characters are trapped. It's a script that treats its premise as a plot mechanism rather than a lens for actually examining anything, and that's the difference between a memorable genre film and one that gets replaced on the top. 10 chart within a week. The A Quiet Place comparison, why that film worked and this one doesn't. It's impossible to watch The Last House without thinking of A Quiet Place, and the film seems to invite the comparison rather than avoid it. Both movies are built around a family unit facing an inexplicable, high-concept threat that forces them into a radically restricted way of living. But where A Quiet Place succeeds, The Last House comes up short, and the difference is instructive. A Quiet Place works because it never loses sight of the fact that its central threat is really a delivery system for a story about family, about protecting your children, about grief, about the specific dynamics of this particular household under this particular pressure. The silence isn't just a horror gimmick, it's a lens that reveals character. Every choice the family makes under that constraint tells you something about who they are. The Last House borrows the shape of that story: a family, a house, an inexplicable rule that must be obeyed to survive without doing the character work that made the A Quiet Place formula resonate in the first place. It's the difference between a film built around three-dimensional people responding to an impossible situation and a film built around a clever, what-if, experiment that happens to have 4 characters standing inside it. Close your eyes and picture The Last House in your head. Based on the premise alone, there's a good chance the version you imagine is more compelling than the one that made it to screen. Character development. 4 people, 0 history. This is the film's core wound, and it's worth dwelling on because it's the root cause of almost every other problem The Last House has. For a movie that spends its entire runtime with exactly 4 characters, in one location, there is remarkably little sense of who any of them are outside the crisis. We don't get glimpses of what this family's life looked like before the doors sealed. We don't get the small, telling details: an old argument, an inside joke, a habit that make a fictional family feel like an actual family rather than a narrative convenience. That absence matters enormously in confinement horror specifically, because the entire emotional engine of the subgenre depends on the audience believing these particular people, with this particular history, are the ones trapped together. Strip that away, and what's left is a premise wearing a family costume: 4 bodies who need to survive rather than 4 people the audience has any real reason to be invested in beyond basic human sympathy. By the time The Last House reaches its climax, the film has fully abandoned whatever psychological horror ambitions it started with in favor of more straightforward action beats. This is where Leterrier's strengths as a director are most visible. The staging is competent, the pacing tightens up, and there's a sense of forward motion that the sluggish middle act badly needed. But it also feels like a bit of a bait and switch. The movie that hooks you with an eerie, ambiguous premise about a house that won't let you leave ends up resolving itself with the rhythms of a much more conventional thriller, trading the specific, unsettling dread of its opening for generic, replaceable spectacle. It's not that the ending is incompetently executed, it's that it feels like a different, less interesting movie than the one the first 20 minutes promised. The Last House is one more entry in a genre that has spent the last few years working through COVID-era isolation anxiety without articulating anything particularly fresh about that experience. It has a can't-miss premise, a strong central performance from WagnerMoura, and a handful of clever grace notes: the DVD gag, the dog dilemma that hinted the sharper, more thoughtful movie buried somewhere inside this one. But a great, What If isn't the same thing as a great movie, and The Last House never develops its characters, its themes, or its scares enough to make good on its own premise.